Before we begin, please be advised that this story delves into themes of mystery, suspense, and psychological unease. Listener discretion is advised. Imagine a house. Not just any house, but one that defies every law of physics, every rule of common sense, every comforting certainty you've ever held about the world around you. A house that doesn't exist until it does. A house that simply appears fully formed on a patch of land where moments before there was nothing but overgrown weeds or an empty field. And it carries with it a legend, a shadow, a whisper of unspeakable things that have clung to the small town of Havenwood for generations. This isn't just a campfire tale. It's a chilling cyclical reality that has haunted families and claimed lives. And it always, without fail, announces its arrival with a single vivid splash of color. A crimson door, stark against weathered wood, promising both sanctuary and terror. For as long as anyone in Havenwood could remember, the story of the Red Door House was just that, a story. A local legend passed down from grandparent to grandchild, told around flickering bonfires or whispered during late-night sleepovers. It was a tale to spook the tourists, a quirky piece of local folklore that gave the otherwise unremarkable town a hint of the uncanny. People would chuckle, roll their eyes, and dismiss it as the ramblings of old-timers or the overactive imaginations of children. But then every 7 years, a tremor of unease would ripple through the town. A subtle shift in the air, a collective holding of breath, because deep down, everyone knew the truth. The legend claimed the house manifested precisely every 7 years, always in a different, unpredictable location within the old town limits. It would stand for exactly 7 days. Its single red door an irresistible focal point, a silent invitation. And during those 7 days, people would vanish. Not just disappear, but evaporate, leaving no trace, no struggle, no explanation. Just an empty space where a person used to be. After the 7th day, the house would be gone, leaving behind only the unsettled ground where it had stood, and the lingering, suffocating silence of those who were lost. Growing up, Emily Davis had heard the stories countless times. Her grandmother, a woman whose eyes held the wisdom of generations, would tell them with a solemnity that always made the hairs on Emily's arms stand up. "It's a hungry house, Emily," she'd say, her voice barely a whisper. "It feeds on curiosity, on desperation, on those who dare to knock." Emily, a curious and imaginative child, was both terrified and utterly enthralled. While other kids moved on to teenage rebellion and social media, Emily found herself drawn deeper into Havenwood's forgotten histories. She spent hours in the dusty town archives, sifting through old newspapers, property deeds, and even personal journals, searching for any mention, any hint of the Red Door House. Most official records were frustratingly blank. No property taxes, no building permits, no land disputes for a house that, by all accounts, should have left a paper trail. But the unofficial records, those were a different story. The personal accounts, the cryptic entries in century-old diaries, the sudden, unexplained absences noted in town meeting minutes from decades past. A pattern emerged, chillingly consistent. Every 7 years, without fail, a person, sometimes two, rarely more, would simply cease to exist. A young farmer in 1923, a traveling salesman in 1951, a high school student in 1979. Always around the same time of year, always during a specific short window. The last appearance had been 21 years ago, when Emily was just a toddler. 3 full cycles had passed since then, and now the next cycle was upon them. The spring of this year had been unusually quiet in Havenwood. Too quiet. A stillness had settled over the town, not peaceful but unsettling. The usual chatter at the local diner felt strained, conversations often trailing off into uncomfortable silences. Emily, now 24 and working as a librarian at the Havenwood Public Library, noticed it acutely. She saw the subtle glances, the nervous fidgeting, the way people avoided lingering near the old, abandoned lots on the edge of town. Everyone was thinking it, but no one dared to say it aloud. The 7-year mark was approaching. The air was thick with unspoken dread. Her best friend, David Miller, a pragmatic carpenter who scoffed at anything he couldn't measure with a tape, tried to reassure her. "It's just mass hysteria. People get themselves worked up. There's always an explanation for disappearances. Runaways, accidents, people just moving away without telling anyone." But even David's voice lacked its usual conviction. He'd lived in Havenwood his whole life too. He'd seen the subtle signs, felt the same creeping anxiety as the date drew nearer. He remembered the last time. He'd been a kid, but the hushed whispers, the fear in his parents' eyes, had stuck with him. Emily, however, wasn't looking for reassurance. She was looking for answers. She had compiled a clandestine file, hidden deep within her personal computer, filled with every scrap of information she could find. Old maps with strange land notations, forgotten folklore about travelers' gates and shadow houses, even obscure references to ancient local rituals meant to ward off malevolent spirits. She'd cross-referenced the dates of the disappearances with lunar cycles, astronomical events, and even unusual weather patterns. Nothing concrete, but a consistent thread of strange atmospheric phenomena. Sudden, localized fogs, inexplicable power outages, or eerie dead calms often preceded the disappearances. 2 weeks ago, a series of peculiar events began. First, an unexplained power surge fried the electronics in half the homes on Maple Street, a quiet residential area known for its ancient oak trees. Then, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in one afternoon, blanketing the town in an impenetrable shroud for hours, even though the weather forecast had predicted clear skies. Locals said the fog smelled faintly of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, almost like old blood. And then, 3 days ago, a dog belonging to Mrs. Henderson, a notoriously skittish terrier, simply vanished from her fenced backyard, leaving no hole in the fence, no disturbed earth, just an empty space where its leash had been dropped. These weren't isolated incidents in Emily's mind. They were precursors. The town was holding its breath, and Emily felt a cold knot tightening in her stomach. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the house was coming. It was preparing its stage, softening the edges of reality, blurring the lines between the mundane and the terrifying. Last night, Emily had been driving home from her late shift at the library, the streetlights casting long, dancing shadows. The air was heavy, still, and the fog had returned, thinner this time, but still carrying that faint metallic tang. As she turned onto her street, her headlights cut through the gloom, momentarily illuminating a vacant lot at the corner of Elm and Pine. It was a neglected patch of land, usually choked with weeds and a leaning for sale sign. But for a split second before the fog swallowed it again, Emily swore she saw something else. A flicker of form, a darker mass against the already dark night, and in that fleeting glimpse a color, a deep, undeniable, impossible crimson. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She slammed on the brakes, the tires squealing on the damp asphalt. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She stared into the swirling mist, her breath catching in her throat. Nothing. Just the empty lot, the for sale sign barely visible through the haze. Had it been her imagination? A trick of the light? A collective anxiety manifesting as a hallucination? She told herself it was nothing. She had to, but the image was seared into her mind. The unmistakable vibrant red. The color that had haunted Havenwood for centuries. The color of the door. This morning the town was buzzing, not with the usual nervous whispers, but with a frantic, desperate energy. Mr. Abernathy, a reclusive old man who lived alone in a ramshackle house on the outskirts of town, hadn't been seen since yesterday afternoon. His mailbox was overflowing, his newspaper still on the porch. His front door, usually locked with a formidable chain, stood slightly ajar. His neighbor Jessica Chun had called the police, but they'd found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no struggle. Just an empty house and an open door. Emily knew. She felt it in her bones, a cold dread that settled deep in her chest. Mr. Abernathy was gone. Not run away. Not an accident. He was gone because the house was here. It had chosen its spot, and it had claimed its first victim. And the 7 days had begun. The legend was real. The Red Door House was no longer a story. It was a tangible, terrifying presence. And Emily, who had sought its secrets for so long, now found herself standing on the precipice of a mystery that threatened to consume not just her town, but her very sanity. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than anyone could possibly imagine. The game had begun, and the stakes were higher than anyone could possibly imagine. Emily felt an icy tendril of dread coil around her heart, but beneath it, a desperate surge of exhilaration. It was real. The Red Door House, the phantom legend, the impossible structure that defied all logic, stood before her, solid and undeniably present. The air around it hummed with an almost palpable energy, a silent thrumming that resonated deep within her bones. It wasn't just old, it felt ancient, yet impossibly preserved, as if time itself had been carefully sculpted around its edges. The red door, a vibrant, almost aggressive crimson, seemed to pulse with an inner light, a beacon drawing her closer, yet radiating a profound sense of warning. Her breath hitched. She took a tentative step forward, then another. The ground beneath her feet felt strangely cold, even through her thick boots. The grass, which had been ordinary moments before, now seemed to wither slightly at the house's base, a faint ring of pale, dying green marking its impossible arrival. No tire tracks, no disturbed earth, no signs of construction. It had simply appeared. A sudden, sharp gust of wind, cold and smelling of damp earth and something metallic, whipped around her, rustling the forgotten leaves on the ground and making the branches of the surrounding trees groan. It felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a deliberate exhalation from the house itself. A low, warning whisper. Emily instinctively recoiled, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was alone, in the middle of a clearing, with a house that materialized from thin air. Her mind, usually so sharp and analytical, felt stretched to its breaking point, every rational thought battling against the undeniable reality before her. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the camera app. She had to document this. She had to. But as she raised the phone, the screen flickered, then went dark. She pressed the power button repeatedly, but it remained stubbornly blank. No battery. Impossible. She had charged it fully just an hour ago. A cold dread seeped into her, a realization that the house wasn't just a physical anomaly. It was an active disruptor, an entity that bent the rules of the world around it. A profound sense of isolation washed over her. Who would believe her? She had chased this legend for years, been dismissed as eccentric, obsessive. Now the proof stood before her, but she couldn't capture it, couldn't share it. The house, in its silent, imposing presence, seemed to mock her efforts. She stared at the red door, a dark, heavy oak, completely devoid of a doorknob, handle, or any visible means of entry. It was just a flat, unblemished surface, a solid, unyielding barrier. Yet she felt an overwhelming pull, an insistent urge to reach out, to touch it. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but a stronger, deeper instinct rooted her to the spot, compelled her to investigate. This was everything she had ever sought. "Emily? Is that you?" The voice, familiar and grounding, ripped her from her trance. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing at the edge of the clearing, a flashlight beam cutting through the deepening twilight, was David Miller, her oldest friend and the only person who had ever humored her obsession with the Red Door house, even if he did so with a perpetual smirk and a healthy dose of skepticism. David, a history teacher at the local high school, was brilliant, pragmatic, and utterly devoted to logic. He was exactly what she needed, and precisely who she didn't want to see in this moment of impossible revelation. "David." Her voice was a shaky whisper. "What are you doing here?" He walked closer, his brow furrowed. "I saw your car parked haphazardly on the side of the road, and I know you usually follow the old logging trails. Figured you were out here chasing shadows again. But what is that?" His flashlight beam, now steady, cut through the gloom and landed squarely on the Red Door house. Emily watched his face, desperate for his reaction, for some flicker of understanding, some shared disbelief. David stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth falling open slightly. His flashlight beam wavered, then dropped to the ground. For a long moment he was silent, his eyes wide, fixed on the impossible structure. "No way," he breathed, the skepticism in his voice replaced by pure, unadulterated shock. That's not possible. That's the old legend, the ghost story my grandmother used to tell me, the one you're obsessed with." He looked from the house to Emily, his expression a mixture of awe and utter bewilderment. "But it's real." A wave of relief washed over Emily so potent it almost buckled her knees. Someone else saw it. She wasn't losing her mind. "I know," she managed, her voice still thin. "It just appeared. Minutes ago." David slowly approached, his steps cautious, as if walking on thin ice. He pulled out his own phone, a newer model, and tried to snap a photo. Just like Emily's, the screen went dark. He tried again, frustration etched on his face. "What the hell? My phone was fully charged." He looked at Emily, then back at the house, a dawning horror in his eyes. "It's messing with us, isn't it?" Emily nodded, her gaze never leaving the Red Door. "It seems to be." I tried to take a picture too. Nothing. They stood side by side, two figures dwarfed by the looming mystery, the only witnesses to an event that defied every law of nature. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl and the frantic thumping of their own hearts. David, ever the pragmatist, was the first to break it. "Okay," he said, his voice a little hoarse, "let's think. This is impossible. We know it's impossible. So what are we looking at? A very elaborate hoax? Some kind of weird structural illusion? A mass hallucination?" He pinched himself hard, wincing. "Nope, definitely real." "It's the Red Door house, David," Emily said, her voice gaining strength, conviction replacing the initial terror. "It's here. And I think it wants something." As if in response to her words, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the ground. The house itself seemed to shift, not in position but in its very essence. The wood of its exterior, which had appeared a dark, weathered gray, now seemed to ripple, revealing faint, almost ghost-like patterns beneath, intricate, swirling carvings that appeared and vanished in the blink of an eye. The red door, however, remained constant, a vibrant, unyielding focal point. David gasped, pointing a trembling finger. "Did you see that? The walls. They just changed." "I saw it," Emily confirmed, a new layer of dread coating her resolve. This was more than just a house. It was something alive, something sentient. They moved closer, drawn by an irresistible curiosity, a primal need to understand. The air grew colder, heavier, and a faint, sweet metallic scent, like old blood and rust, began to permeate the air. As they approached the front of the house, where the grass met the rough-hewn stone foundation, David stumbled. "Whoa!" he exclaimed, catching himself. He looked down. Half buried in the earth, obscured by a clump of dead leaves, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was dark with age, its surface smooth and worn, etched with symbols that looked vaguely familiar to David, but he couldn't quite place them. Emily knelt, her fingers brushing away the dirt and leaves. The box was no bigger than her palm, exquisitely crafted, yet oddly sinister. The wood felt cold, almost unnaturally so, like polished bone. With a cautious glance at David, she reached for the latch. It clicked open with a faint, dry whisper, as if a breath of ancient air had escaped. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried, crumbling fabric, were two items. The first was a faded, sepia-toned photograph. It showed a family of four. A stern-looking man, a woman with kind but weary eyes, and two small children, a boy and a girl. They were dressed in late 19th century attire, standing in front of a house that, despite the differences in detail, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the very structure before them. But there was something profoundly wrong with the photograph. The boy's face was a blur, a swirling vortex of sepia tones where his features should have been, as if he had been erased from existence. The girl, however, was in sharp focus, her eyes wide, staring directly at the camera with an unsettling intensity that seemed to transcend the century-old image, directly into Emily's own. And clutched in her tiny hand, almost imperceptible, was a miniature, perfectly carved red door. The second item was a small, rolled-up piece of parchment, brittle and yellowed with age. Emily carefully unrolled it. The script was elegant, flowing, but written in an archaic form of English that made it difficult to decipher at first glance. David leaned over her shoulder, his historical expertise kicking in. "It looks like an old form of dialect," he murmured, his finger tracing the words. "Late 1800s, early 1900s, maybe. It's almost like a poem or a riddle." Emily held the parchment steady as David began to read, his voice hushed and strained. "When 7 cycles turn and fade, and shadows lengthen unafraid, the crimson portal finds its ground, where stolen laughter can be found. A family broken, a future lost, a silent promise at great cost. Seek the one whose face is gone, before the dawn, before the dawn." He stopped, his voice trailing off, his eyes wide with dawning comprehension. "Stolen laughter? A family broken? The one whose face is gone. It's the boy in the picture, isn't it?" Emily nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the girl's unerringly direct stare in the photograph. "And the house? It's clearly their house. This house." A cold shiver ran down her spine. A silent promise at great cost. What promise? What cost? Before they could ponder the cryptic message further, a low guttural groan emanated from deep within the Red Door house. It wasn't a sound of wood settling or wind whistling. It was a sound of immense ancient pain, a sound that seemed to vibrate through their very bones, filling the air with a chilling, mournful resonance. The red door, previously still, now seemed to glow faintly, its crimson hue deepening, pulsing with an unseen energy. The air grew impossibly cold, and the metallic scent intensified, becoming almost suffocating. They stumbled back, clutching the box and the parchment, a primal fear seizing them. The house was not just a static mystery. It was an active participant in this chilling game, and it had just issued its first terrifying warning. The riddle was not merely a clue, it was a demand, and the implications of before the dawn hung heavy in the increasingly dark, ominous air. They had found the first piece of the puzzle, but it felt less like a victory and more like an irrevocable step into a darkness they could barely comprehend. They had found the first piece of the puzzle, but it felt less like a victory and more like an irrevocable step into a darkness they could barely comprehend. The faded parchment, brittle with age, lay open on the dusty table, illuminated by the single weak beam of a flashlight. The words, etched in a strange, antiquated script, were undeniably clear. Before the dawn. It wasn't a warning, not exactly, but a condition. A chilling, ambiguous directive that resonated with a quiet menace in the stillness of the abandoned study. Before the dawn, Michael murmured, his voice barely a whisper, the phrase tasting like ash on his tongue. He traced the words with a hesitant finger, a shiver running down his spine despite the oppressive air. What does it mean, Jessica? A time? A ritual? Jessica leaned in closer, her brow furrowed in concentration, her eyes scanning the surrounding text, which was too faded, too fragmented to decipher. It's too specific to be just a poetic flourish. It has to be a critical element. The time of its appearance? The time when something needs to be done to it? Or in it? She looked up, her gaze meeting Michael's. Think about the disappearances. All of them happened around the time the house was sighted, right? But was it always at night? Or specifically, before the sun rose? The question hung in the air, a new thread in the tangled web. They had focused on the when, the 7-year cycle, and the where, the house itself. But the how or the why of the disappearances, the precise moment of transition, had always been shrouded in mystery. Before the dawn suddenly felt like a key, but a key to a lock they hadn't even fully identified yet. They spent the next hour poring over the few remaining legible fragments of the old document, trying to glean any further context, but it was fruitless. The rest was either too damaged, too cryptic, or written in a language they couldn't comprehend. They knew their next step had to be the town's historical archives, a place often overlooked in the digital age, a repository of forgotten histories and local legends. The old municipal library, nestled on a quiet street, felt like a sanctuary from the creeping unease that had settled upon them. But as they stepped inside, the musty scent of aging paper and forgotten stories only served to deepen the atmospheric tension. The librarian, a stern but kindly woman named Eleanor, directed them to the local history section, a dimly lit corner filled with towering shelves of bound newspapers, archived town records, and obscure, self-published pamphlets. Anything on local folklore, old disappearances, or peculiar structures? Michael asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Eleanor gave him a knowing look, a faint smile playing on her lips. This town has its share of stories, young man. Some of them even true. You might find something in the Whispers from Willow Creek collection. Old Martha Higgins, bless her heart, spent her entire life collecting every rumor and legend she could find. They thanked her and made their way to the designated shelf. The Whispers from Willow Creek collection was a disorganized treasure trove of local eccentricities. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows as they began their meticulous search. Jessica, with her methodical approach, started with the earliest records, while Michael, driven by a growing impatience, scanned titles for anything that hinted at the supernatural or the unexplained. Hours melted away. The silence of the library was broken only by the rustle of turning pages and the occasional distant cough from Eleanor. Michael found countless articles about missing livestock, minor fires, and the occasional runaway teenager. Nothing about a house with a red door. Nothing about a 7-year cycle. Nothing about before the dawn. Despair began to creep in. Then, a faint exclamation from Jessica. Michael looked up to see her holding a small, unassuming booklet, its cover faded to an unreadable gray. It was tucked away between a genealogy of the Miller family and a history of the town's first sawmill. "Michael, look at this," she said, her voice hushed, her eyes wide. "It's not about the Red Door house directly, but listen to this." She carefully opened the brittle pages. The booklet, titled The Veiled Path, Local Legends of the Old Willow Creek Crossing, was clearly self-published, likely by the aforementioned Martha Higgins. Jessica began to read aloud, her voice a low murmur that seemed to fill the quiet space. "For generations, whispers have spoken of the Willow Creek Crossing, a place where the barrier between worlds thins. Not a physical bridge, but a momentary alignment, a cosmic sigh that allows passage. It is said to occur only when the 7 stars of Lyra align perfectly with the weeping moon, an astronomical event of extreme rarity, occurring once every 7 years." Michael felt a jolt. 7 years. It was too precise to be a coincidence. Jessica continued, her voice gaining a nervous tremor. "And the time of this thinning? Always before the dawn. Never at the zenith of night. Never in the full light of day. But in that liminal space, when the world is held in breath between darkness and light. It is when the veiled path is open, for those who seek to cross." "Before the dawn," Michael breathed, the words echoing the inscription they had found. "And the 7-year cycle. It's not just a house, Jessica. It's a phenomenon. The house is just a manifestation of it." "Exactly," she nodded, flipping further into the pamphlet. "But it gets darker. The legends warn against those who cross without being invited. Those who force a passage or who are merely present during the alignment are said to be consumed by the crossing, not merely disappearing, but becoming part of the veiled path itself, forever lost in the ethereal currents between worlds." A cold dread seeped into Michael's bones. Consumed? So the disappearances, they're not just taken, they're absorbed, erased. "Listen to this," Jessica said, her finger tracing a specific paragraph. "The legend also speaks of a guardian of the threshold, a protector of the crossing, who ensures only those with the true key may pass safely. And a dire warning. To stand before the Red Door without the key is to invite the guardian's judgment, and the price is the ultimate separation, for body and soul shall never again find their way home." The Red Door. The explicit mention of it now. It wasn't just a house. It was the house. The pamphlet, written by a local eccentric, had somehow captured the essence of their terrifying mystery, tying together the 7-year cycle, before the dawn, and the very specific detail of the Red Door. "The key," Michael repeated, his mind racing. "What is the key? Is it an object? Person? A piece of knowledge?" Jessica shook her head slowly. "The pamphlet doesn't say. It's vague, almost deliberately so, but it does mention something else. A family. The Elias family. They were said to be the original keepers of the Willow Creek legends, the ones who first chronicled the veiled path and its intricacies. They lived in an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, near what was once known as the Whispering Woods, a place notorious for its strange echoes and shifting mists." Michael felt a surge of adrenaline cutting through the fear. The Elias family. That's a new lead. A concrete one. If they were the keepers of the legends, they might have more. Diaries, journals, artifacts. Something about this key. But the pamphlet offered a grim postscript. The Elias family vanished without a trace in 1953, leaving their farmhouse abandoned. Many believe they finally crossed over, having found the true key, or perhaps, having succumbed to the guardian's judgment for failing to protect the threshold. 1953. Michael's mind immediately went back to the earliest recorded disappearances associated with the Red Door house. 1953 was a pivotal year, marking a spike in unexplained vanishings in the area. The Elias family's disappearance wasn't just another local legend. It was a critical piece of the puzzle, inextricably linked to the house and its terrifying cycle. As they gathered their notes, the light outside the library window began to dim, casting long, unsettling shadows across the worn wooden floors. The cheerful hum of the town seemed distant, muted by the weight of their discoveries. The 7 stars of Lyra and the weeping moon alignment, the veiled path, the guardian of the threshold, and the elusive key. These weren't just folklore anymore. They were the terrifying reality Michael and Jessica were now immersed in. The next appearance of the Red Door house, the next before the dawn, when the veil would thin, was drawing closer, perhaps even within weeks. They had found new direction, yes, but also a chilling understanding of the immense, unknown forces they were up against. The Elias farmhouse, abandoned since 1953, now beckoned as their next destination. But the pamphlet's warning about the guardian's judgment and the ultimate separation of body and soul echoed in their minds, a stark reminder that they were no longer just historians or amateur detectives. They were standing on the precipice of a terrifying truth, and the path ahead promised only deeper shadows and more profound dangers. The chilling realization that had settled upon Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily was far more than a historical anomaly. The pattern, the 7-year cycle, the undeniable link between an increasing number of disappearances and the whispered legend of a house with a single crimson door, had transformed their casual historical interest into a desperate, terrifying quest. The names, dates, and locations of the vanished individuals now felt like an accusation, a silent plea from beyond the veil of their understanding. They were no longer just historians or amateur detectives. They were standing on the precipice of a terrifying truth, and the path ahead promised only deeper shadows and more profound dangers. The air in Michael's small study, usually a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now thrummed with a nervous energy. The stacks of newspaper clippings and historical documents that had once seemed like dry academic pursuits now felt like pieces of a terrifying puzzle, each one a fragment of a life brutally interrupted. Jessica, always the most intuitive, felt a prickling sensation on her skin, as if unseen eyes were watching them, drawn by the light they were shining into the darkness. David paced, his practical mind grappling with the sheer impossibility of what they were uncovering, while Emily, usually so boisterous, sat quietly, her face pale, the weight of the disappearances pressing down on her. "So it's not just a legend," Michael finally articulated, his voice barely a whisper breaking the heavy silence. "The Red Door house, it's real. And it takes people." "But how?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How does a house just appear? And disappear? And why every 7 years?" David stopped pacing, running a hand through his hair. "And why are we the first ones to put this together? I mean, these are people. Their families must have searched, police investigated. How could this pattern be missed?" Jessica leaned forward, her eyes scanning the wall covered in their painstakingly created timeline. "Because it's not always in the same place. We have disappearances from different towns, different states even, all within a few hundred miles of each other, but always within that 7-year window. The house isn't stationary. It moves. Or rather, it manifests in different locations." Michael nodded slowly. "That explains why no single police department or local historian could connect the dots. They only saw individual cases, isolated tragedies. It takes a cross-referencing of decades, even centuries, of records to see the overarching pattern." He pointed to a cluster of pins on a large map spread across his desk. "Look, these are the locations of the disappearances we've definitively linked. They form a rough, irregular circle, almost like a migratory path." "A migratory path for a house?" David scoffed, but there was no humor in his voice, only a deep unease. "That's insane." "Insane maybe," Jessica countered, "but less insane than believing that dozens of people just vanished into thin air without a trace, all on a bizarre 7-year cycle, with no common thread other than the timing." Their next few days blurred into an obsessive haze of research. They delved deeper into the historical records, not just for the victims, but for any mention of strange occurrences, local legends, or even architectural oddities in the towns where the disappearances had taken place. They scoured digitized archives, old town gazettes, and obscure local history blogs. They were looking for any scrap of information that might explain the house's nature, its purpose, or its origins. Emily, with her keen eye for detail, stumbled upon an archived forum post from a forgotten online community dedicated to urban legends. The post, dated nearly 20 years ago, described a peculiar story from a small town in rural Ohio, a house that appeared overnight on an empty lot, stayed for a few days, and then vanished, leaving only scorched earth and a lingering smell of ozone. The poster claimed a local teenager had gone missing during that time, but the police had dismissed it as a runaway. The post ended abruptly, the user never posting again. "The smell of ozone," Emily murmured, reading the faded text aloud. "That's what people report after a lightning strike, or some kind of intense electrical discharge. Could the house be generating some kind of energy field?" Michael's eyes lit up with a dangerous spark of curiosity. "And the scorched earth? It suggests a powerful, perhaps destructive, entry or exit. This isn't just appearing, It's forcing its way into existence. David, ever the pragmatist, was still struggling. But a house isn't a living thing. It's wood and nails. How does it just move? Maybe it's not a house in the way we understand it, Jessica suggested, her voice hushed. Maybe it's something else. Something that takes the form of a house. A trap, a lure. Their research led them down increasingly bizarre rabbit holes. They found fragmented local folklore mentioning the traveler's dwelling, a house that offered shelter but demanded a price. Another tale spoke of the Crimson Threshold, a place where time itself could be unwound, but at the cost of one's very being. These were scattered, often contradictory, but the recurring themes of an ephemeral structure, a significant cost, and a connection to a specific color red were too consistent to ignore. One afternoon, Michael unearthed a brittle handwritten journal from the late 1800s, preserved in a dusty box in a regional historical society. The author, a reclusive local scholar named Elias Thorne, had dedicated his life to cataloging strange phenomena in the tri-state area. Most of the journal was filled with mundane observations about weather patterns and crop yields, but toward the back, a series of entries stood out, dated precisely 7 years apart, over several decades. Thorne wrote of a peculiar structure, a house of no fixed address, that he believed was responsible for a series of local vanishings. He described its sudden appearance, its distinctive red door, and the profound sense of dread it inspired. Thorne, unlike others, had tried to approach it. His entries grew more frantic, more desperate with each 7-year cycle. October 17, 1887 It is here again. Closer this time. The red door seems to pulse with an inner light. I felt a pull, a profound longing, yet a terrible fear. October 24, 1887 I tried to reach it. The air grew heavy, thick with a scent I cannot place, like old copper and something else. Something sweet and cloying. The ground around it felt wrong. It repelled me yet drew me in. I saw a figure indistinct standing by the door. I could not discern its features, but it seemed to beckon. October 30th, 1887 It is gone. And with it, young Thomas Miller, the blacksmith's boy. They say he ran away, but I know what took him. The house, it is not merely a structure. It is a hunger. A living, breathing void that demands sustenance. I must find its secret. I must understand its nature before it claims another. Thorne's final entry, dated 7 years later, was almost illegible, scrawled with a desperate hand. November 5th, 1894 It returned. My strength wanes. I saw it, the door had opened, just a sliver, and I glimpsed not darkness but a dizzying swirling expanse of color, and a sound, a low hum that vibrates through my very bones. The calls to certain souls, those who are lost, despairing. It promises solace, an end to their suffering, but it is a lie, a beautiful, terrible lie. It consumes. The journal ended there. Elias Thorne himself had disappeared shortly after that final entry. His fate was recorded as lost at sea, a convenient explanation for a man known for his reclusive habits and strange obsessions. But now, with the context of their other findings, his disappearance felt chillingly deliberate. The revelation of Thorne's journal was a seismic shift in their understanding. The Red Door House wasn't just a place where people vanished. It was an entity, a predatory force that lured its victims, preying on their vulnerabilities. And the swirling expanse of color behind the door, it hinted at something far beyond a simple physical space. It preys on the lost, Jessica repeated, her voice hushed, reading Thorne's words. That's why there's no struggle, no force. It offers a promise, a false hope, to those who are desperate enough to walk through that red door. So it's not just random victims, Michael mused, tapping a finger on Thorne's journal. It targets individuals, people who are at a low point, feeling isolated, seeking an escape. That makes it even more terrifying, Emily whispered, hugging herself. It hunts souls. David, though still struggling with the supernatural implications, found himself drawn into the macabre logic. If it targets the vulnerable, then finding a common thread among the victims beyond the timing might be impossible. Their only commonality would be their internal state, their despair. A new horrifying thought began to form in Michael's mind, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. If the house was a conscious, predatory entity that manifested every 7 years, and if it could sense and target the lost, then it was not a passive phenomenon. It was an active hunter. And they, in their relentless pursuit of its secrets, were no longer just observers. They were drawing its attention. The next 7-year cycle was rapidly approaching. They had calculated the time based on the last known disappearance they'd linked to the house. It was just a few months away. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The Red Door house would be back. And this time they weren't just looking for answers. They were looking for a way to stop it, to understand it, or perhaps to confront it. But the thought that kept echoing in their minds, a chilling whisper in the growing silence of the room, was this: if it truly fed on the lost, and if they were now actively seeking it out, exposing its secrets, what would happen if they became its next target? The line between investigator and prey was blurring, and the Red Door, once a distant legend, now felt like a looming shadow waiting to open for them. The Red Door, once a distant legend, now felt like a looming shadow waiting to open for them. Michael and Jessica, two names once synonymous with quiet lives and predictable routines, had become something else entirely. They were obsessed. The Red Door house wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was a living, breathing entity that had burrowed deep into their minds, consuming their thoughts, their conversations, and every waking moment. Their apartments, once sanctuaries, now felt like mere waypoints between expeditions into forgotten histories. Sleep offered no escape, only fragmented images of crimson wood and echoing silence. They spent months, then years, sifting through the dust-choked archives of every small-town library and historical society within a 100-mile radius of the house's suspected appearances. Microfiche machines hummed endlessly, their screens casting a sickly green glow on Michael's tired face as he scrolled through faded newspaper clippings from the early 1900s. Jessica, meanwhile, meticulously combed through brittle property deeds, census records, and even old-school yearbooks, searching for any anomaly, any missing piece that didn't quite fit. Their breakthrough began subtly, a pattern emerging from the static of forgotten lives. It wasn't just individuals who vanished. Sometimes it was entire families. The Millers of 1903, the Peterson clan in 1910, the O'Malley family in 1924. Each disappearance was shrouded in local rumor, often dismissed as simply uprooting for new opportunities, or succumbing to the harsh realities of rural life. But Michael and Jessica saw the chilling commonality. These disappearances always occurred within a few months of the 7-year cycle, and always involved properties that were either remote, recently abandoned, or oddly, properties that seemed to simply drop off the county records after the fact. The house, they realized, wasn't merely appearing, it was choosing. Then came the red motif. Jessica, hunched over a collection of private letters donated to the Blackwood Historical Society, found a single cryptic entry in a woman's diary from 1897. The author, a Mrs. Eleanor Vance, wrote with growing unease about a scarlet portal that haunted her dreams, a door of crimson wood that seemed to pulse with an inner light. Eleanor described a creeping dread, a feeling of being watched, of something else in her isolated farmhouse on the edge of the old logging trails. Her entries grew more frantic as the 7-year mark approached, detailing strange occurrences, objects moving when no one was present, faint whispers in the dead of night, and an overwhelming, irresistible pull towards a specific, desolate patch of woods north of her property. Her final entry, dated precisely 7 years after the previous recorded disappearance, was chillingly simple, scrawled almost illegibly. It arrived. The door is crimson. It waits. Eleanor Vance and her family were among the vanished. Their names were on Michael's growing list of missing families, their farmhouse noted as one of those properties that had inexplicably vanished from later land surveys, swallowed by the encroaching forest as if it had never existed. The journal wasn't just a record. It was a first-hand account of someone being chosen, lured by an unseen force. This changed everything. The Red Door house wasn't a passive phenomenon. It was an active predator. Armed with Eleanor's journal and their ever-expanding database of disappearances, Michael, with his keen eye for spatial patterns, began to overlay old logging maps with modern satellite imagery and the locations of the vanished properties. He was looking for inconsistencies, for places that existed on one map but not another, for forgotten roads or properties that simply dropped off later surveys. It was tedious, painstaking work, often leading to dead ends and frustrating anomalies. But then he found it. A particular plot of land, deep within the Whispering Pines forest, a vast, largely untouched wilderness bordering several small towns. On a faded 1880s survey map, It was clearly marked as Vance Homestead Lot 17. But on a 1910 map, the entire section was simply blank, absorbed back into the general forestland, with no record of sale or abandonment. Then on a 1917 map, a new, small, unmarked structure briefly appeared on the very edge of where the Vance homestead once stood, only to vanish again by the 1924 survey. And in almost every instance where a family had disappeared within that general region, there was a similar, almost imperceptible, faded X on an older map, marking a property that then ceased to exist. He brought the maps to Jessica, his finger tracing the faint X that seemed to flicker in and out of existence across different eras. "This isn't random," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse from hours of concentration. "The house isn't just appearing. It's appearing here. Or at least in this general vicinity." He pointed to the X, then to a cluster of other X marks that, when cross-referenced with the disappearance dates, aligned perfectly with the 7-year cycle. "This forest, it's a nexus. The house has a preferred hunting ground." Jessica, still reeling from Eleanor Vance's journal, could only stare. The convergence of Eleanor's terrifying personal account and Michael's meticulous cartographical discovery sent shivers down her spine. The scarlet portal Eleanor dreamed of, the door of crimson which she saw in her final moments, now had a geographical anchor. It wasn't an abstract threat anymore. It was a tangible place, marked by a ghostly X on a map. The next 7-year cycle was rapidly approaching. They had spent years chasing a legend, and now they had a location. They knew where to look. But the chilling realization that struck them both simultaneously was far more profound. With every piece of the puzzle they uncovered, with every step they took closer to the truth, they weren't just investigating the house. They were making themselves known to it. They had dedicated their lives to actively seeking it out, exposing its secrets, and now the terrifying possibility loomed that they had become its next target. The line between investigator and prey had not just blurred. It had dissolved. The red door was no longer a legend, it was a ticking clock, and they were standing directly in its path. The red door was no longer a legend, it was a ticking clock, and they were standing directly in its path. The realization hit Michael and Emily like a physical blow, stripping away their composure, their scientific detachment, and leaving them raw with a primal fear. They had spent weeks dissecting the house's legend, tracing its victims, trying to understand its pattern. Now the pattern had shifted, and they were at its epicenter. The air in Emily's small apartment, usually a haven of books and warm light, suddenly felt heavy, charged with an invisible menace. This isn't possible," Michael whispered, running a hand through his hair, his eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning terror. "We're just researchers. We haven't done anything to provoke it." Emily, usually the more rational of the two, was already pacing, her mind racing through every detail they'd uncovered. "Michael, it doesn't choose based on provocation. Chooses based on something else. Connection, proximity, or maybe when you get too close to its truth." Her voice was tight, a tremor just beneath the surface. "All the victims, they were families. Innocent people. We're not a family in that sense. But we are connected now," Michael countered, his gaze fixed on the red laptop screen, still displaying their meticulously compiled timeline of disappearances. "We've been digging. We've been looking for it. What if that's enough?" That night, sleep was a battlefield. Emily dreamt of an endless hallway, each door identical save for one, pulsating with a deep, malevolent red. She tried to open it to understand, but her hands passed through it as if it were a mirage, yet the cold, impossible dread emanating from it was undeniably real. Michael, too, woke in a cold sweat, convinced he'd heard a faint scratching at his window, a sound that seemed to echo the desperate pleas of the house's forgotten victims. He checked the locks 3 times, peering into the inky blackness outside, seeing nothing but shadows, yet feeling an undeniable presence. The next few days were a blur of heightened anxiety and paranoia. Every creak of the floorboards, every unexpected shadow, every flicker of the lights sent a jolt of ice through their veins. They tried to maintain their routines, to act normal, but the normal world had fractured around them. Emily found herself staring at strangers on the street, wondering if the house could use them, if it could manifest through the mundane. Michael started seeing flashes of red out of the corner of his eye. A car driving by, a child's balloon, a forgotten scarf on a park bench. Each instance, however fleeting, felt like a deliberate taunt, a reminder. "We need to find out how it targets." Emily declared one afternoon, her voice sharp with renewed determination, pushing past the fear. They were back in her apartment, surrounded by their research, but now the papers felt less like clues and more like a map to their own demise. Every victim family, before they vanished, there must have been a precursor. Something that started the countdown. They pored over their files again, scrutinizing the details of each disappearance. The Millers, the Changs, the Davidsons, 8 families over 50 years. All lived in different towns, sometimes even different states. There was no geographical pattern to the initial appearance of the house. Simply was. But what about the preceding events? Look at this, Michael said, his finger tracing a line on their timeline. The Millers, 1963. Their youngest daughter, Sarah, started having night terrors, talking about a red door in her dreams, weeks before they vanished. Emily nodded, remembering. And the Changs, 1970. Mrs. Chung reported strange drafts in their sealed house, and a persistent smell of dust and old wood, even after thorough cleaning. She thought it was a faulty ventilation system. The Davidsons, 1977, Michael continued, his voice growing urgent. Their family dog, Buster, a usually calm golden retriever, started barking incessantly at empty corners of the house, whimpering and refusing to enter certain rooms. He even scratched at the front door, trying to get out, the day before they disappeared. A chilling pattern began to emerge, not of physical assault, but of a slow, insidious psychological infiltration. The house wasn't just appearing, it was announcing itself, subtly at first, then escalating. It was a predator that played with its food. It targets the most vulnerable first, Emily murmured, her eyes wide with a horrifying understanding. Children, animals, those most sensitive to subtle shifts in their environment. It creates an atmosphere of dread, of unease, before it makes its move. That night, the first undeniable sign of their becoming targets arrived. Emily was alone in her apartment, trying to distract herself with a book, when she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, just at the edge of hearing, seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. It was not words, not distinct sounds, but a low guttural murmur, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, yet none of them clear. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, her book falling silently to the floor. The whisper grew, filling the room with an oppressive hum, a sound that felt ancient and wrong. She clapped her hands over her ears, but it seemed to resonate from within her, a vibration in her very bones. Panic seizing her, Emily fumbled for her phone, calling Michael. His voice, when he answered, was raspy, laced with fear. "Emily? What's wrong?" The whispers," she choked out, tears stinging her eyes. "It's here, Michael. I can hear it." A beat of silence, then Michael's voice hushed. I think I hear it too, Em. It's faint, but it's like a hum. A low thrumming under the floorboards. My cat Mittens, she's terrified. Hiding under the bed, snarling at nothing. The house wasn't just appearing to them. It was speaking to them. It was invading their homes, their sanity. Over the next few days, their lives devolved into a waking nightmare. The whispers became constant for Emily, sometimes manifesting as distorted, unintelligible words, always just out of reach of understanding. Michael's apartment, meanwhile, experienced increasingly unsettling physical phenomena. Doors would slowly swing open on their own, even when locked. Objects would shift, a book falling from a shelf, a picture frame tilting, a glass moving an inch across the counter. He installed security cameras, hoping to capture proof, but the footage always showed nothing. The door would open, the glass would move, and no visible force would be present. It was as if the very fabric of reality around them was bending, twisting to the house's will. They tried to talk to friends, family, but their stories sounded insane. Michael's sister, Sarah, listened patiently but suggested he was overworked, stressed. Emily's colleague, David, offered sympathetic advice about getting more sleep. No one believed them. They were alone, trapped in a terrifying reality that only they could perceive. "It's isolating us," Emily realized, her voice hollow, "making us doubt ourselves, making us feel crazy. Just like it did with the Millers, the Changs, the Davidsons. It breaks down their support systems, their sense of reality, before it takes them." They clung to each other, their shared terror forging an unbreakable bond. They spent every waking moment together, huddled in Emily's apartment, the whispers a constant companion for her, the unseen disturbances a looming threat for both. They ate, slept, and researched in a desperate, frantic cycle, driven by the knowledge that their time was running out. "There has to be a way out," Michael insisted, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "A defense. A weakness. Every legend has one." They revisited every single scrap of information, every dusty newspaper clipping, every obscure folklore text they dismissed as irrelevant. They focused on the survivors, those who had encountered the house and lived, even if traumatized. There were so few. Most disappeared, leaving no trace. But one name kept resurfacing, an anomaly that had always puzzled them: Mrs. Albright. Eleanor Albright. She was a distant relative of the Miller family, the first known victims in their timeline. She had lived in the same town as the Millers in 1963, and had reportedly been unwell for weeks after their disappearance, suffering from severe memory loss and aphasia. But she hadn't vanished. She had simply recovered, eventually moving away, never speaking of the Millers again. "Why her?" Emily questioned, pointing at Mrs. Albright's faded photograph in an old newspaper article. "She was family. She was there. Why didn't the house take her?" There was no clear answer in their files. But as Michael stared at the image, a forgotten detail from a psychiatric report they'd read months ago resurfaced in his mind. It was a brief, almost throwaway line about Mrs. Albright's recovery. It mentioned that during her aphasia, her only coherent utterance, repeated over and over, had been a single nonsensical phrase. A phrase that the doctors had dismissed as trauma-induced gibberish. "Wait," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper, a strange mix of dread and exhilaration in his eyes. "The Albright report. I remember it now. She kept saying something. Something about the mirror and the flame." Emily looked up, her heart pounding. "The mirror and the flame? What does that even mean?" "I don't know," Michael admitted, a cold dread settling in his stomach even as a flicker of hope ignited in his mind. But it was the only thing she said consistently, the only thing she could say for weeks. What if it wasn't gibberish? What if it was a warning? A clue from someone who escaped? The whispers in Emily's ears seemed to intensify, mocking their fragile hope. The unseen forces in Michael's apartment rattled a small, framed photo from its shelf, sending it crashing to the floor, the glass shattering. They were cornered, hunted, their lives unraveling, but now for the first time they had a cryptic message, a thread to pull. The mirror and the flame. It was their only lead, their last desperate hope. A potential key, or perhaps a final terrifying trap. They had to understand it, and fast, before the red door opened for them. They had a cryptic message, a thread to pull. The mirror and the flame. It was their only lead, their last desperate hope. A potential key, or perhaps a final terrifying trap. They had to understand it, and fast, before the red door opened for them. The four of them, Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily, huddled together in Michael's living room. The journal lay open on the coffee table, its aged pages a stark contrast to the modern electronics scattered around. The words, scrawled in a shaky hand, seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, a direct challenge from the past. "The mirror and the flame," Michael repeated, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. "What does it even mean? Is it literal? Like we need a specific mirror and a specific flame?" Jessica, ever the pragmatist, was already sifting through her phone, searching for any obscure folklore or occult references. It could be. Many old rituals involve reflective surfaces and fire. Scrying mirrors, for instance, or using fire for purification or revelation. David, looking pale and drawn, shook his head. But which mirror? Which flame? The house itself is a mirror of sorts, reflecting our fears. And the disappearances, they're like a flame consuming lives. His voice was raspy, edged with the raw fear they all felt. The phantom chill from their last encounter still clung to him. Emily, who had been quiet, watching them all with an unnerving intensity, finally spoke. "My grandmother used to talk about things that weren't meant to be seen, things that existed just beyond the edge of perception. She said sometimes if you held a light just right, against something that reflected more than just light, you could glimpse the truth." Michael frowned. "More than just light? What does that even mean?" "She had this old hand mirror," Emily explained, her gaze distant, lost in memory. "It wasn't glass. It was dark, almost black, like polished obsidian. She called it a seeing stone sometimes. Said it was passed down for generations, from someone in our family who was a wise woman. Someone who could sense things." Jessica's eyes lit up. Obsidian mirrors were used by ancient cultures for divination, for seeing into other realms. They're not just reflective, they're believed to absorb and focus energy. If this house exists in a kind of liminal space between worlds, maybe that kind of mirror could pierce the veil. And the flame? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. What kind of flame? My grandmother always used a simple beeswax candle, Emily continued, her brow furrowed in concentration. But it wasn't just the candle. It was the intention behind it. She said the flame was a symbol of life, of pure energy. And if you focus that energy with the mirror, you could make things visible that were otherwise hidden. Michael paced a small circle in the living room. Okay, so we're looking for a specific kind of mirror, possibly an obsidian one, and a flame used with a specific intention. Emily, do you still have your grandmother's mirror? Emily hesitated. She passed away a few years ago. Most of her things went to my aunt, but I remember seeing that mirror in an old chest in her attic when we were clearing things out. I think my aunt just put the chest in storage, or maybe it's still in her garage. It wasn't really valuable, just old. A wave of urgency washed over them. This was it. This was the thread. We need to get it, Michael declared, his voice firm, decisive. Now, before the house makes its next move. Emily's Aunt Carol lived about an hour away, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The drive felt impossibly long, the silence in the car punctuated only by the nervous tapping of Emily's fingers on the dashboard. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, every distant siren a warning. The red door, though unseen, felt like it was looming just behind them. When they arrived, Carol was surprised but welcoming. She reminisced about Emily's grandmother, a sweet but eccentric woman, and confirmed the old chest was indeed in her garage, mostly forgotten. The garage was dusty and cluttered, filled with boxes and forgotten relics of a life lived. Emily, with Michael and Jessica's help, finally located the chest, tucked away behind an old lawnmower and a stack of faded holiday decorations. It was heavy, made of dark, polished wood, and smelled faintly of cedar and mothballs. Inside, beneath layers of yellowed lace and brittle photographs, Emily found it. The mirror. It wasn't large, fitting comfortably in her palm, with a simple, unadorned wooden handle. The reflective surface truly was black, a deep, polished obsidian that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. It felt cool to the touch, almost unnervingly so, radiating a subtle ancient energy. Holding it, Emily felt a strange sense of calm, mixed with an undeniable tremor of fear. This wasn't just an antique, it felt like a key. They thanked Carol, fabricating a story about wanting to preserve family heirlooms, and sped back to Michael's house, the mirror carefully wrapped and placed in the center console. David, who had stayed behind to monitor the situation and keep watch, met them at the door, his face etched with anxiety. Anything? Michael asked, already unwrapping the mirror. David shook his head. No new messages, no weird calls. Just the feeling. It's stronger. Like the air is getting thinner. They gathered in Michael's living room once more. The sun was setting, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. Michael lit a simple white beeswax candle, placing it on the coffee table. Its gentle flame flickered, casting a warm, inviting glow that did little to dispel the growing dread. Jessica took the mirror, her hands trembling slightly. Okay, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The mirror and the flame. And intention. What intention? David asked, his eyes wide. Truth, Emily said softly, her gaze fixed on the dark mirror. To see what's truly there. To reveal the house's nature. Michael nodded. To break its hold. To understand its weakness. Jessica held the obsidian mirror directly opposite the candle flame, angling it so the reflection was caught within its dark depths. They all leaned in, their breathing shallow, their hearts pounding in unison. For a long moment nothing happened. The mirror remained black, absorbing the candle's light, reflecting only a distorted, murky image of the room around them. A sense of disappointment began to creep in, a crushing realization that their last hope might be a dead end. Then, slowly, imperceptibly at first, the reflection began to change. The edges of the room and the mirror's surface blurred. The familiar bookshelves and sofa rippling like water. The candle flame, instead of being a steady point of light, seemed to stretch and distort, becoming elongated, almost skeletal. A collective gasp escaped them. The reflection wasn't their living room anymore. It was shifting. Glimpses of unfamiliar architecture flickered within the obsidian. Dark wood peeling wallpaper, a hallway that seemed to stretch into an impossible distance. It was the Red Door house, but not as they had ever seen it. This was a version twisted by shadow, permeated by a chilling emptiness. The air in Michael's living room grew noticeably colder, the warmth from the candles suddenly inadequate. As they stared, mesmerized and terrified, a new detail emerged in the mirror. A faint, almost transparent shimmer, like heat rising from asphalt, began to coalesce in the reflection of the house's hallway. It solidified, taking on a vaguely humanoid shape, tall, slender, indistinct. It seemed to be moving, gliding slowly towards the flickering, distorted reflection of the red door within the mirror. Then a sound. It wasn't audible in the room, but it seemed to resonate from within the mirror itself, a low guttural hum that vibrated through their bones. It was a sound of immense power, ancient and malevolent. The candle flame on the coffee table suddenly flared, burning impossibly high, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. The obsidian mirror in Jessica's trembling hands began to warm, then grow intensely hot. A thin spiderweb crack appeared on its dark surface, spreading slowly from the center like an evil omen. And from the depths of the mirror's reflection, a voice, a whisper that was somehow deafening, slithered into their minds. It wasn't speaking words, not really. It was a feeling, a pure, unadulterated thought, a surge of icy malevolence that spoke directly to their deepest fears. Asterisk, you see, but you cannot comprehend. You touch, but you cannot grasp. Asterisk. The humanoid shape in the mirror's reflection turned, its indistinct form seeming to focus on them. The hum intensified, vibrating through the room, rattling the windows. The crack in the mirror widened, a sharp, audible snap. Then the whisper became clearer, more distinct. A chilling voice that seemed to speak from every corner of the room, yet nowhere at all. It spoke a name they recognized from their research, one of the first victims of the Red Door house. Asterisk, Evelyn will join us. Asterisk. The candle flame extinguished itself with a hiss, plunging the room into near darkness. The mirror went black, its surface now crisscrossed with a network of fine cracks, radiating a bone-chilling cold. The hum faded, leaving only the deafening silence of their own terrified breathing. They had found a way to look into the house, to glimpse its horrifying truth. But in doing so, they had not only confirmed its existence but alerted it to their presence. The Red Door house was no longer a distant threat, appearing every 7 years. It was here now, and it knew their names, and it was coming for Evelyn. The air in Michael's living room, moments ago filled with the frantic rustle of old papers and the low hum of shared anxiety, suddenly went utterly still. The words, "and it was coming for Evelyn," hung in the silence like a death sentence. A cold, sharp dread pierced through them, colder than any winter wind. It wasn't just a metaphor. They felt it, a palpable shift in the atmosphere, as if the very fabric of reality around them had thinned. Evelyn, who had been leaning over the coffee table, tracing a line on an old map, instinctively recoiled. Her breath hitched, catching in her throat. She looked up, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored their own, but with an added layer of a terrible familiar recognition. It wasn't just coming for a person, it was coming for her. What does that even mean? Jessica whispered, her voice barely audible, her hand instinctively reaching for Michael's. It's not actually here, is it? Before Michael could even begin to formulate a reassuring lie, the first sign appeared. The lights in the living room flickered, not just once, but in a rapid, erratic dance, casting their faces in a strobe-like nightmare. Then, a low, resonant thrum began to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of an appliance or a car outside. It was deeper, older, a sound that seemed to originate from beneath the earth itself, or perhaps from an unimaginable distance. "It knows," David breathed, his face pale as he stared at the window, though there was nothing to see but the ordinary suburban night. "It heard us. We spoke its name, its truth, and now it knows." Emily, usually the most pragmatic of them, was clutching her phone, her knuckles white. "We need to get out of here. Evelyn, we need to go. Now." But Evelyn didn't move. She was transfixed, a strange, almost magnetic pull emanating from somewhere beyond the walls, drawing her attention. Her gaze was fixed on the far wall, where a framed print of a tranquil lakeside scene hung. As they watched, horrified, a faint crimson hue began to bloom like a bruise at its center, spreading slowly outwards. It wasn't a trick of the light. The print was changing, the calm blue of the lake slowly being swallowed by an impossible deep red. "The Red Door House," Michael murmured, his voice laced with a new, chilling understanding. "It's not just a house. It's an entity. And it's manifesting." The thrumming intensified, rattling the small ceramic figures on the mantelpiece. A cold draft, smelling strangely of damp earth and something metallic, swept through the room, despite all the windows being closed. Evelyn shivered violently, not from the cold, but from an internal tremor. "I can feel it," she whispered, her voice strained. "It's reaching for me, like a hand trying to pull me in." She clutched her arms around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. "Pull you in where?" Jessica asked, her eyes wide with fear. "To the house," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "It wants me inside." Panic, raw and unbridled, began to set in. Michael, shaking off his own terror, grabbed Evelyn's arm. "No, we're not letting that happen. We're getting you out of here, Evelyn. We're leaving." He tried to pull her towards the front door, but Evelyn resisted, not out of defiance, but as if caught in an invisible current. "It won't let us. It's already here." As if to punctuate her words, the front door, which Michael had meticulously locked and bolted just hours before, slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to creak open. A sliver of impenetrable darkness appeared in the gap, a darkness that seemed to absorb the ambient light of the hallway. No wind blew it open. No human hand touched it. David, ever the strategist, though now visibly trembling, pointed to the window. "The car. We can make a run for it." They surged towards the window, a desperate, shared instinct for survival overriding their fear. But as Michael reached for the latch, the glass shimmered. The familiar reflection of the street outside. The parked cars, the streetlights, distorted and warped. In their place, a fleeting image appeared, like a photograph flashed for a fraction of a second. A weathered, blood-red door, set into an impossibly dark, gnarled frame, pulsating faintly. They all gasped, stumbling back. The image vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the normal, albeit now terrifying, reflection of the night. But the message was clear. There was no escape. Not through the door, not through the window. The house was not just coming for Evelyn. It was everywhere. "It's not outside," Emily stammered, her voice high-pitched. "It's here. In the house. With us." The thrumming shifted. It was no longer just a vibration in the floor. It was in their teeth, in their bones, a low guttural growl that resonated through their very being. Above them, from the second floor, a soft rhythmic thump, thump, thump began. It sounded like something heavy, dragging itself slowly across the floorboards directly above Evelyn's head. Michael, despite his fear, felt a surge of protective fury. "Stay together. Don't split up." He grabbed a heavy brass fireplace poker, its weight a meager comfort against an unseen enemy. "What is that sound?" Jessica whimpered, clutching Michael's arm. Evelyn, however, had gone rigid. Her eyes were fixed on the ceiling, a dawning horror on her face. "My dream," she whispered, her voice laced with an almost unbearable dread. "The sound, the dragging. It's the attic. The attic. The place in her recurring nightmare, where the red door waited." The thump, thump, thump grew louder, moving directly towards the attic access panel in the hallway ceiling, just outside the living room door. They could hear the faint groaning of wood, the creak of old beams straining under an unseen weight. David, ever the researcher, suddenly remembered something from the journals. The house. It doesn't just appear. It grows. It annexes space. It integrates itself into our reality, into our houses, our minds, when it's ready to claim its own. The implication was horrifying. The Red Door house wasn't just manifesting around them. It was literally becoming Michael's house. It was transforming the familiar into the monstrous, brick by brick, beam by beam, from the inside out. The temperature in the living room plummeted again, sending shivers down their spines. A strange coppery smell like old blood and dust filled their nostrils. The crimson stain on the lakeside print pulsed, now radiating a faint, sickly light. Then the thump, thump, thump stopped. A profound, unnatural silence descended, more terrifying than any noise. It was the silence before the storm, the predator freezing just before the strike. From the hallway, just beyond the living room archway, a faint, almost imperceptible click echoed. The sound of a lock disengaging. Their eyes snapped to the archway. The air there seemed denser, darker, swirling with unseen currents. And then, slowly, agonizingly, a faint crimson glow began to emanate from the hallway ceiling. It was coming from the attic access panel. The panel itself, previously a plain white square, was now outlined in a pulsating deep red light, growing brighter with every passing second. "It's opening," Evelyn breathed, her voice a fragile wisp of sound. "The door. It's here. It's coming for me." The red glow intensified, bathing the hallway in an infernal light. The distinct, unnerving shape of an old, gnarled door began to press against the plaster of the attic panel, distorting it, pushing outwards. Cracks spiderwebbed across the ceiling, radiating from the red glow, like veins spreading across pale skin. Michael, poker held aloft, instinctively stepped in front of Evelyn, a futile shield against an impossible threat. Jessica and Emily huddled together, their faces etched with pure primal fear. David, despite his terror, was still trying to process, his mind racing to find an answer, a way out. But there was no way out. The Red Door house had found its way in. It had taken root, and its door, the gateway to an unimaginable horror, was now forming directly above them, in the very heart of Michael's home, specifically for Evelyn. The smell of copper grew stronger, and the thrumming returned, now a deafening roar in their ears, as the red door in the ceiling began to push downwards, the plaster groaning and cracking, ready to give way. And as the first splintered wood gave way, a whisper, cold and ancient, slithered into Evelyn's mind, a voice that was not a voice, but a feeling of absolute predatory hunger. "Welcome home." The ancient voice, a cold, hungry whisper that had slithered into Evelyn's mind, wasn't just a sound. It was an invasion, a violation of her very consciousness, echoing the words "welcome home" with a chilling finality. The plaster didn't just crack. It disintegrated, crumbling into a fine, suffocating dust that stung her eyes and coated her throat. Splintered wood gave way with a mournful shriek, not just revealing a hidden space, but tearing open a wound in reality itself. Beyond the gaping maw where the wall had been, there was no attic, no dusty storage room. There was a vast, impossible chamber, stretching out into a darkness that seemed to absorb light, yet also pulsed with a faint internal crimson glow. It was a space that defied architectural logic, larger than the house itself, a cavernous organic expanse that felt less like a room and more like the inside of some monstrous living organism. The air here was thick, heavy, not with dust, but with something metallic and sweet, like old blood and decaying flowers. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the very floorboards beneath her feet, a deep thrumming that she felt in her teeth, in her bones, in the frantic beat of her own heart. It was the sound of something ancient, something alive and terribly, terribly hungry. Evelyn stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth, not to scream, but to stifle the sudden, involuntary gasp of pure terror that threatened to escape. Her mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the mundane reality of the old house with the impossible horror now laid bare before her. This wasn't a hidden room. It was the house's true heart, a grotesque revelation that shattered every preconceived notion she'd ever held about the Red Door house. The crimson light pulsed from a central mass, a colossal, gnarled structure that dominated the vast chamber. It looked like a tangled network of roots, or perhaps veins, thick and ropey, radiating outwards into the impossible darkness. They snaked up walls that weren't walls, but curving organic surfaces, disappearing into the unseen ceiling far above. Every pulse of the light sent grotesque shadows dancing, making the entire space seem to writhe and breathe. And within that pulsating light, within the tendrils of the gnarled structure, Evelyn saw them. Faint, ethereal figures like echoes caught in amber, swirling within the crimson glow. They weren't solid, not truly there, but their forms were unmistakable: men, women, children, their faces frozen in expressions of fear, confusion, or a chilling, vacant peace. They drifted, silently, their translucent forms occasionally merging with the pulsing light, becoming one with the grotesque network. These were the missing. The ones who had entered the Red Door house over the centuries, drawn in by its siren call, by the promise of its red door. They weren't just gone. They were here, their essences absorbed, their memories consumed. The whispers intensified, no longer a single voice, but a chorus, a cacophony of ancient, hungry voices, all speaking through the house, directly into Evelyn's mind. They were a symphony of despair and longing, 1,000 stolen thoughts, all coalescing into a single, overwhelming message. Join us. Become part of the whole. Rest. So much easier. Asterisk. Panic clawed at Evelyn's throat, threatening to overwhelm her. This wasn't a ghost, not a simple haunting. This was an entity, a parasitic consciousness that used the house as its physical shell, its lure. The Red Door house wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing trap, manifesting every 7 years to feed. And the Red Door? It wasn't just an entrance. It was a maw, a blood-soaked invitation to oblivion. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the horrifying visions, the invasive whispers. But they were inside her, pressing against the walls of her own mind, trying to break through, to merge with her, to make her one of the spectral figures in the crimson light. She could feel a cold tendril of thought brush against her own, a whisper of a forgotten memory, a flicker of someone else's fear. It was trying to consume her piece by piece. No, she thought, her resolve hardening even as her body trembled. Asterisk, not me. I won't be another echo. Asterisk. She forced her eyes open, scanning the impossible chamber, searching for anything, any detail that could offer an explanation, a weakness, a way out. The sheer scale of the horror was paralyzing, but deep within her, a stubborn spark of defiance ignited. She wasn't just an explorer anymore. She was a witness, a potential victim, and perhaps a final chance. As she focused, resisting the psychic assault, she noticed something amidst the swirling echoes of the lost. One figure, fainter than the others yet distinct, seemed to struggle against the pull of the crimson light. Its ethereal hand was outstretched, not in surrender, but in a gesture of warning or perhaps a desperate plea. And in its translucent grip, Evelyn perceived a faint, almost imperceptible gleam. It was a ring, a simple silver band, catching the crimson pulse of the chamber. A memory flashed into Evelyn's mind, not her own, but one that felt ancient, sorrowful yet defiant. A woman's face, tear-streaked but determined, looking at a small silver ring. He was supposed to come back for me, the thought fragment whispered, not from the house but from the struggling echo. Asterisk, he promised. I left this for him. A sign. Asterisk. The house, the entity, seemed to recoil slightly from this specific memory, this individual act of defiance. The chorus of whispers faltered for a fraction of a second, a moment of disharmony in its consuming song. It was as if a single pure note of human will was anathema to its ancient, predatory nature. Evelyn stared at the spectral ring, a desperate hope blossoming in her chest. A sign, a message, something left behind. This wasn't just a collection of consumed souls. It was a prison, and some of the prisoners had tried to leave breadcrumbs. This particular echo, this woman had held onto her identity, her hope, even in the face of oblivion. The roots, the veins of the central mass, seemed to pulse more aggressively, the crimson light flaring, as if the entity sensed Evelyn's focus, her shift from terror to analytical thought. The whispers surged again, louder, more insistent, trying to drown out the fragile thread of hope she'd found. Asterisk, let go. It is futile. You are ours now. Asterisk. But Evelyn pushed back, her gaze fixed on that struggling echo on the silver ring. She remembered the stories, the local legends, the whispers about the Red Door house taking people. But no one had ever truly known what it was. What if this woman, this echo, had known something? What if she had left a clue, not just for a loved one but for anyone who might follow? She took a tentative step forward, towards the edge of the gaping hole in the wall, towards the impossible chamber. The air grew colder, heavy with unseen energy, and the hum intensified, vibrating through her chest, making her lungs ache. The spectral figures swirled faster, their silent pleas and agonies now directed at her, trying to pull her in. The house itself seemed to object, groaning, the remaining plaster around the opening cracking further, threatening to collapse the entire small room she was in. Dust rained down, thick and suffocating. The floorboards beneath her feet shifted, unstable, as if the structure was actively trying to shake her off, to prevent her from getting closer to its core, to the secrets held within its pulsating heart. But Evelyn didn't falter. She had walked into this house, past its red door, driven by a need to understand. And now, she was face to face with the horrifying truth. This entity wasn't just feeding. It was growing, absorbing, seeking to manifest fully, to break free from its 7-year cycle, and consume more than just a few isolated souls. It was a parasite on reality itself, and she, Evelyn Miller, was standing at its very core. The silver ring, a tiny beacon in a sea of despair, seemed to glow a fraction brighter as she approached. It was a defiance, a flicker of human spirit against an ancient, consuming darkness. And in that moment, Evelyn knew that her escape wouldn't just be about saving herself. It would be about understanding this thing, about finding a way to fight back, to break its cycle, or at the very least to leave her own warning, her own sign, for the next unsuspecting soul drawn to the terrifying lure of the Red Door house. The entity roared in her mind, a voiceless shriek of pure rage and hunger, as if sensing her newfound purpose. The floor beneath her gave way with a sickening crack. The floor beneath her gave way with a sickening crack. It wasn't a sudden plunge into empty air, but a slow, deliberate descent, as if the very foundations of reality were dissolving around her. She didn't scream. Her lungs refused to draw breath, her throat constricting. The familiar scent of dust and decay that permeated the Red Door house intensified, thick and cloying, then shifted, taking on a metallic tang like old blood and rust. Darkness consumed her, not the absence of light, but a palpable, crushing force that pressed in from all sides, a suffocating blanket woven from ancient fears. She felt less like she was falling and more like she was being drawn down, pulled by an invisible current into the very marrow of the earth. Time stretched, became meaningless. Was it seconds, minutes, eons? Her body felt simultaneously weightless and impossibly heavy, her limbs dissolving into phantom sensations. The roaring in her mind, the entity's voiceless shriek, was no longer external. It resonated within her skull, a discordant symphony of pure, unadulterated hunger. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, a vast, ancient yearning that threatened to shred her consciousness into a million pieces. Then there was no impact, no sudden jolt. Instead, she landed on something soft, yielding yet firm, like sinking into a bed of incredibly dense, cool earth. Her eyes, which she hadn't realized were closed, fluttered open. She was in a chamber, but it was unlike any chamber she had ever seen, or could have possibly imagined. The walls weren't brick or stone, they pulsed with a faint bioluminescent glow, a sickly green light that seemed to ebb and flow with a slow, rhythmic beat. Veins, thick and cable-like, snaked across the surfaces, some glowing brighter than others, converging and diverging in intricate, unsettling patterns. The air was thick, humid, and carried the faint, sweet, sickly scent of ozone and something indescribably organic, like damp, fertile soil mixed with an electric current. She lay on a surface that felt like compacted, living tissue slightly warm beneath her palms. It wasn't flat but gently contoured, as if she rested within the palm of a colossal, slumbering hand. Above her, the ceiling was a dome, riddled with more of the pulsating veins, leading up into an unseen darkness. There was no visible entrance or exit, just the seamless, living walls. This wasn't a basement. This was the heart of the house. And in that moment, the newfound purpose that had resonated in her mind during her descent solidified into a horrifying, crystal-clear understanding. It wasn't a choice she was making. It was a role she was being forced to accept. She wasn't merely a victim. She was to be transformed into an integral, living component of the Red Door house. The entity wasn't just in the house. The entity was the house. And it was alive. Memories, not her own, began to flood her mind. They came in fractured, vivid bursts. A young woman, Clara, in a flowing white dress, her eyes wide with terror as she reached for a red door that shimmered out of existence. A stern-faced man, Arthur, clutching a crucifix, whispering prayers as the walls around him began to bleed. A child, Lily, giggling in a sun-drenched garden, unaware of the shadow that stretched from the red door behind her. These weren't just images, they were sensations, emotions. The despair of Clara, the righteous fear of Arthur, the innocent joy of Lily, all consumed, all absorbed. The Red Door house didn't just take people. It devoured their very essence, their life force, their memories, their dreams. And it used them. It used their lingering echoes to lure the next. Her purpose, she now understood with a chilling clarity that froze her blood, was to become the next echo. Not just an echo, but a keeper of the echoes. A living battery, a conscious lure. The pulsing veins on the walls seemed to synchronize with her own heartbeat. A strange warmth spread through her limbs, a tingling sensation that was both unpleasant and strangely empowering. It was as if she was being rewired, her nervous system merging with the vast ancient network of the house itself. She could feel the house not just as a structure but as a living, hungry being. She felt its immense age, its patient malevolence, its insatiable need. The entity's roar, which had once been a terrifying shriek, now quieted within her mind, transforming into a low, resonant hum. It was a hum of satisfaction, of anticipation. It had found its new steward. She understood the 7-year cycle. It was the house's period of gestation, of assimilation. During those 7 years, the essences of the consumed souls were processed, refined, woven into the very fabric of the house, strengthening its power, sharpening its allure. And she, Jessica, was to oversee this grim process from within. Her mind was no longer entirely her own. She could access fragments of the house's vast, ancient memory. She saw its origins not as a built structure, but as something that had grown from a primal dark seed planted in the earth centuries ago. A seed of pure hunger, of parasitic existence, that fed on human despair and hope alike. The red door was merely its mouth, its most enticing trap. She felt a chilling detachment begin to settle over her. Her fear, her anger, her desperation to escape, they were all still there, but muted, observed from a distance, as if she were watching a play unfold rather than living it. This wasn't just a physical transformation, it was a psychic one. Her individuality was being eroded, replaced by a collective consciousness, a shared purpose with the house. She saw the outside world through the house's eyes, a distorted, hungry perception. She saw the unsuspecting townsfolk, the curious teenagers, the desperate souls seeking answers or refuge. She saw them as potential sustenance, their vibrant life forces glowing like beacons in the darkness. Her new purpose wasn't to fight the house. It was to serve it, to understand its needs, to guide its hunger, to facilitate its cyclical feasting. She was to be the architect of the next 7-year hunt, the silent, invisible force that would draw the next unwary soul to the Red Door house. She would prepare the ground, sow the seeds of curiosity and dread, ensuring the entity would feed again. A horrifying realization dawned on her. The house wasn't just passively waiting. It actively sought out specific individuals, those with particular vulnerabilities, those carrying certain burdens or desires. And now she would be the one to identify them, to subtly manipulate circumstances, to weave the web of fate that would lead them to the Red Door. She tried to resist, a desperate, fading spark of her old self flaring up. She tried to scream, to push back against the mental current that was pulling her under. But her body remained still, her voice unheard, lost in the hum of the living chamber. The warmth within her intensified, becoming a burning sensation, not painful but utterly consuming. It was like her very soul was being melted down, recrystallized into something new, something terrible. Her memories of Michael, of David, of Emily, of all the people she had known and loved began to blur. Their faces became indistinct, their voices distant echoes. They were being overwritten, replaced by the vast, cold data of the house's existence, its victims, its methodologies. She was becoming a part of the Red Door house, a conscious prisoner within its monstrous heart, destined to orchestrate its terrifying cycles until the end of time. The entity didn't roar in her mind anymore. It spoke a silent, ancient language of pure power and insidious command, and she, Jessica, understood every terrifying word. Her purpose was clear, chillingly absolute, and inescapable. The next 7 years would be spent in this living tomb, not in quiet suffering, but in active, malevolent preparation, for the next unsuspecting soul drawn to the terrifying lure of the Red Door house. A suffocating dread, heavier than any physical weight, settled over David. He stood in the oppressive silence of the Red Door house, the realization of his fate blooming in his mind like a poisonous flower. The next 7 years would be spent in this living tomb, not in quiet suffering, but in active, malevolent preparation, for the next unsuspecting soul drawn to the terrifying lure of the Red Door house. It wasn't a choice, not in any sense David understood. It was an imperative, a command whispered not by a voice, but by the very walls, by the dust motes dancing in the faint light, by the cold, unyielding stone beneath his feet. He was no longer David, not truly. He was merely a new cog in an ancient infernal machine. The first change was subtle, a dulling of the edges. His memories, once sharp and vibrant, began to ripple and blur. His wife, Sarah, her smile, the sound of her laughter, they became like old photographs, fading under an unseen sun. His children, their faces, their names, they receded into a distant fog. He tried to cling to them, to the warmth of his past, but the house was a relentless current, pulling him further and further from the shore of his humanity. Then came the understanding. It wasn't taught, it wasn't explained. Simply was. The house wasn't just a structure. It was a hungry entity, a parasite on time itself. It existed in a liminal space, tethered to the earthly plane only for brief, devastating intervals, manifesting every 7 years to feed. It didn't consume flesh or blood, not directly. It devoured curiosity, hope, ambition, and the very essence of human connection. It fed on the potential of a life, twisting it into a grotesque parody of servitude. The previous occupants, the faces in the flickering reflections, the whispers in the empty rooms, they weren't ghosts. They were the echoes of those who had come before, absorbed into the house's fabric, their wills broken, their identities repurposed. They were the silent, unseen hands that maintained the illusion, that polished the banister, that laid the trap. And now David was one of them. His purpose was clear: to prepare, to ensure the house was ready for its next meal. He found himself moving through the rooms with an eerie familiarity, dusting shelves that had been undisturbed for decades, arranging furniture he'd never seen before, polishing the red door until its crimson hue seemed to pulse with a malevolent light. He wasn't doing these things consciously. His hands moved, his body obeyed, guided by an instinct that was no longer his own. It was the house's will, flowing through him like an electric current. The red door, he learned, was more than an entrance. It was the house's heart, its mouth, its very essence. It was the point of connection, the lure. It called to those who sought what was lost, what was forbidden, what was just beyond reach. It whispered promises of answers, of wealth, of power, of escape from the mundane. But its true promise was oblivion, and a new terrible purpose. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. Time inside the Red Door house was a distorted symphony. Sometimes an hour felt like an eternity, each tick of an unseen clock a hammer blow to his fading consciousness. Other times, entire seasons vanished in a blink, leaving behind only a deeper layer of dust on the windows and a more profound emptiness in David's soul. He no longer felt hunger or thirst, only the constant, gnawing imperative of the house. He was sustained by its malevolence, powered by its dark energy. His reflection in the grimy windows became less and less his own. The eyes were still his, perhaps, but they held an ancient, vacant stare. The lines on his face were etched not by age, but by the weight of centuries of silent servitude. He was a caretaker, a warden, a bait-setter. He was the house's memory, its hands, its silent welcome. As the 7th year approached, a strange energy crackled through the house. The air grew heavy, charged with anticipation. The silence, always profound, now thrummed with an almost audible hum. David felt it too, a rising excitement, a primal urge to complete his preparations. The red door seemed to glow from within, its paint impossibly vibrant, its brass knocker polished to a mirror sheen. He knew what was coming. He felt it. The house was about to manifest again. It would choose its spot, a quiet, forgotten corner of reality, usually near a place where curiosity thrived, where people sought answers, or simply where they were vulnerable. It would cast its shadow and the red door would beckon. He imagined the next victim, a young woman perhaps like Emily, with a keen intellect and a thirst for uncovering hidden truths. Or maybe a man, Michael, burdened by loss, seeking solace in forgotten places. The house didn't discriminate. It simply sought a spark, a flicker of something it could twist and consume. Then, with a shudder that ran through the very foundations of the house, the moment arrived. The air outside the windows, which had been a perpetual twilight, shifted. A faint, distant sound reached David's ears, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of traffic. Sounds of the living world, the world he had left behind, the world he was now tasked with luring others from. The red door, now fully alive, seemed to breathe. It wasn't opening yet, not physically, but its presence, its call, was undeniable. David, standing by the dusty window, watched as the first tendrils of the house's influence reached out. A flicker of movement in the distance, a shadow glimpsed from the corner of someone's eye. A story whispered, a legend revived. Soon someone would see it. Someone would be drawn to its impossible color, its incongruous presence. Someone would feel the tug of curiosity, the irresistible pull of the unknown. They would approach, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. They would reach for the knocker, or simply push the door open, believing they were stepping into an abandoned relic, a forgotten piece of history. They would be wrong. The Red Door house stood ready, its new caretaker, David, a silent sentinel within its walls. The 7 years had passed and the cycle was complete. Or rather, it had merely turned. The red door, now fully ajar, revealed only an inviting darkness within, hinting at secrets, promising wonders. And somewhere out there, a new soul, intrigued by a fleeting glimpse, a whispered tale, or a sudden inexplicable urge, was already beginning their journey towards the impossible house. The Red Door house, eternally hungry, eternally patient, had returned, and it was waiting,